Have you ever heard of a courtroom decision so shocking that it makes the entire nation stop and question what justice really means? Imagine the CEO of one of America's biggest healthcare companies, gunned down in broad daylight on the streets of New York City, and now the suspect, who is still facing murder charges, suddenly has the terrorism charges against him tossed aside. This isn't fiction, this is real life, and it has unfolded in one of the most high-profile cases the city has seen in years. Today, we dive deep into the story of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson's tragic death, the suspect Luigi Mangione, and the courtroom battle that has left many shaken. The story begins in December 2024, on a cold afternoon in Manhattan. Brian Thompson, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, one of the largest health insurance providers in the United States, was walking near his office. It was broad daylight, people filled the sidewalks, and traffic moved normally along the avenues. No one could have imagined that in just a few moments chaos would erupt. Witnesses recall hearing a sharp crack, a gunshot echoing through the streets. People screamed, some ducked, others ran. When the smoke cleared, Thompson lay bleeding on the pavement, mortally wounded. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but he didn't survive. The city had just lost one of its most influential business leaders in the most brutal way possible. Almost immediately, police identified and arrested a suspect, 38-year-old Luigi Mangione. Witnesses had seen him at the scene, and surveillance cameras captured his movements. Prosecutors moved quickly, not just charging him with second-degree murder, but also invoking a rarely used state-level terrorism statute, a law crafted in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. Their reasoning was simple. They believed Mangione had targeted Thompson not just out of personal grievance, but with the intent to send a broader message, to intimidate, to influence either the government or the civilian population at large. When the terrorism charges were announced, it sent shockwaves through the business world and the public. For many, it amplified the gravity of the case. Killing the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, a company responsible for the healthcare coverage of millions of Americans, seemed like more than just a random act of violence. It sounded like something designed to destabilize, to frighten, to create uncertainty. But in court, proving that was never going to be easy. To meet the legal threshold for terrorism under New York state law, prosecutors had to show that Mangione acted with intent to influence government policy or intimidate the civilian population. And as the months passed, the evidence to back up that claim appeared thin. In May of this year, Mangione's defense team launched an aggressive campaign to dismiss the state charges. They argued that his rights had been violated, that the prosecution's evidence was flimsy, and that there was no credible proof tying his actions to any political motive or broader agenda. They painted him as a disturbed man, perhaps fueled by personal resentment, but not a terrorist in the legal sense. This was a tragic killing, yes, one of his defense attorneys said during a hearing, but to call it terrorism stretches the law far beyond what it was meant for. My client did not intend to topple governments or terrorize the public. The prosecution is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Prosecutors countered fiercely, insisting that Mangione's actions had symbolic weight, that his choice of target, a high-profile healthcare executive, was not coincidental. They hinted at online writings and statements Mangione had made in the months before the shooting, suggesting hostility toward corporations and healthcare policies. But the more closely the appellate judges scrutinized the case, the less convinced they seemed that it reached the standard required for terrorism. And then came the decision. On Tuesday, a New York appellate court issued its ruling. The terrorism charges were tossed out. The panel of judges wrote that prosecutors had presented insufficient evidence to show Mangione acted with the intent outlined in the Post 9/11 law. It was a stunning blow for the state, stripping away one of the most serious charges in the case and narrowing the focus back to second-degree murder. The ruling underscored a critical legal point. Not every high-profile or symbolic act of violence can automatically be labeled as terrorism, no matter how much it shakes the public. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. As the decision was read, Mangione sat stone-faced, while his defense attorneys quietly exchanged relieved glances. Across the aisle, prosecutors looked grim, knowing their most ambitious charge had just been struck down. Families of victims, including Brian Thompson's loved ones, sat in silence, absorbing the news. For them, it was another painful chapter in a story that had already torn their lives apart. One relative was overheard whispering, "So that's it? Just murder? They kill him and it's not terrorism." Yet the case is far from over. Mangione still faces the central charge of second-degree murder. And in addition, federal prosecutors have stepped in. At the federal level, he is charged with murder as well, and the Department of Justice has already signaled its intention to pursue the death penalty. That announcement alone has sparked fierce debate, as New York itself does not have the death penalty, but under federal law, it remains a possible punishment. Legal analysts have noted that the federal case may become the true centerpiece of the prosecution going forward, especially since the state-level terrorism element is gone. What makes this case even more complicated is how the public has responded. In a surprising twist, some younger Americans, particularly on social media platforms, have expressed sympathy not for the victim, but for Mangione. They frame his act as a rebellion against corporate greed, against a healthcare system they believe exploits ordinary people. It's a deeply controversial stance, one that has outraged many, but it highlights the fractured ways in which Americans interpret violence in an era of political and economic disillusionment. Comment threads fill with heated arguments, some calling Mangione a murderer who deserves no sympathy, others calling him a symbol of resistance against a broken system. It's a battle not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Journalists covering the case have described the scene outside the courthouse after the appellate ruling. Protesters had gathered, some holding signs demanding justice for Brian Thompson, others oddly carrying placards with slogans blaming corporations and calling Mangione a scapegoat. Police kept a careful eye on the crowds, wary of clashes. One reporter recalled hearing a young protester shouting, "This isn't terrorism, this is desperation," while an older man fired back, "Tell that to the family who lost their father, their husband, their leader." The appellate court's ruling also raises important legal and philosophical questions. If Mangione's crime isn't terrorism, what exactly qualifies? The law was meant for acts like bombings, mass shootings with clear political motives, coordinated attacks aimed at changing policy or terrorizing populations. But when a lone gunman targets a powerful figure, where is the line drawn? Some legal scholars argue that keeping the definition narrow is necessary to prevent overreach. Otherwise, any crime with a symbolic target could be unfairly labeled terrorism. Others argue that excluding cases like this diminishes the gravity of politically or socially motivated violence. Meanwhile, inside federal court filings, prosecutors are preparing their case with meticulous detail. They intend to prove not just that Mangione killed Thompson, but that he did so with malice and premeditation, making him eligible for the ultimate punishment. In Washington, DOJ officials have privately expressed confidence that the federal trial will deliver what the state case could not, a decisive verdict that carries maximum weight. But defense attorneys are gearing up too, insisting they will challenge every piece of evidence and argue against the death penalty at every turn. For Brian Thompson's colleagues at UnitedHealthcare, the past months have been a nightmare. Employees speak quietly about the day of the killing, about the shock of losing a man who guided their company through turbulent times. One former coworker said in an interview, "He wasn't perfect, but he believed in the mission of healthcare access." To see his name dragged into this circus, to see people actually sympathizing with the guy who murdered him, it's devastating. Corporate leaders across the country have also taken note, with some reportedly increasing their security in response to the attack. As the legal battle stretches on, the case stands as a mirror to America's divisions. It is about law and definitions, yes, but it's also about deeper frustrations, about trust in institutions, about anger toward corporations, about the way violence is interpreted in a polarized society. The courtroom may deliver a verdict, but the broader conversation is just beginning. And for the family of Brian Thompson, the fight for justice feels far from over. As one relative said outside the courthouse after the ruling, with tears in their eyes, "Terrorist or not, he stole Brian from us. And no court ruling can ever give him back." This case, with all its twists, its legal complexities, its social reverberations, is not just the story of one man's violent death. It's the story of how America defines justice in the modern age. And as we await the federal trial, the question hangs heavy in the air. Will Luigi Mangione be remembered as a cold-blooded killer, or as a symbol twisted by some into something larger than himself? Only time and the courts will decide.